Mrs. Smith had been carried away from her first direction, and Anne had forgotten, in the interest of her own family concerns, how much had been originally implied against him. But her attention was now called to the explanation of those first hints, and she listened to a recital which, if it did not perfectly justify the unqualified bitterness of Mrs. Smith, proved him to have been very unfeeling in his conduct towards her, very deficient both in justice and compassion. She learned that the intimacy between them continuing unimpaired by Mr. Elliot's marriage, they had been, as before, always together, and Mr. Elliot had led his friend into expenses much beyond his fortune. Much beyond his fortune. Mrs. Smith did not want to take blame to herself, and was most tender of throwing any on her husband, but Anne could collect that their income had never been equal to their style of living, and that from the first there had been a great deal of general and joint extravagance. From his wife's account of him, she could discern Mr. Smith to have been a man of warm feelings, easy temper, careless habits, and not strong understanding, much more amiable than his friend, and very unlike him, led by him, and probably despised by him. Mr. Elliot, raised by his marriage to great affluence, and disposed to every gratification of pleasure and vanity which could be commanded without involving himself, for with all his self-indulgence he had become a prudent man, and beginning to be rich, just as his friend ought to have found himself to be poor, seemed to have had no concern at all for that friend's probable finances, but, on the contrary, had been prompting and encouraging expenses which could end only in ruin, and the Smiths accordingly had been ruined. The husband had died just in time to be spared the full knowledge of it. They had previously known embarrassments enough to try the friendship of their friends, and to prove that Mr. Elliot's had better not be tried, but it was not till his death that the wretched state of his affairs was fully known. With a confidence in Mr. Elliot's regard more creditable to his feelings than his judgment, Mr. Smith had appointed him the executor of his will. But Mr. Elliot would not act, and the difficulties and distresses which this refusal had heaped on her, in addition to the inevitable sufferings of her situation, had been such as could not be related without anguish of spirit, or listened to without corresponding indignation. Anne was shown some letters of his on the occasion, answers to urgent applications from Mrs. Smith, which all breathed the same stern resolution of not engaging in a fruitless trouble, and, under a cold civility, the same hard-hearted indifference to any of the evils it might bring on her. It was a dreadful picture of ingratitude and inhumanity, and Anne felt at some moments that no flagrant open crime could have been worse. She had a great deal to listen to, all the particulars of past sad scenes, all the minutiae of distress upon distress which in former conversations had been merely hinted at, were dwelt on now with unnatural indulgence. Anne could perfectly comprehend the exquisite relief, and was only the more inclined to wonder at the composure of her friend's usual state of mind. There was one circumstance in the history of her grievances of particular irritation. She had good reason to believe that some property of her husband in the West Indies, which had been for many years under a sort of sequestration for the payment of its own encumbrances, might be recoverable by proper measures, and this property, though not large, would be enough to make her comparatively rich. But there was nobody to stir in it. Mr. Elliot would do nothing, and she could do nothing herself, equally disabled from personal exertion by her state of bodily weakness, and from employing others by her want of money. She had no natural connections to assist her even with their counsel, and she could not afford to purchase the assistance of the law. This was the cruel aggravation of actually straitened means, to feel that she ought to be in better circumstances, that a little trouble in the right place might do it, and to fear that delay might be even weakening her claims, was hard to bear. It was on this point that she had hoped to engage Anne's good offices with Mr. Elliot. She had previously, in the anticipation of their marriage, been very apprehensive of losing her friend by it, but on being assured that he could have made no attempt of the nature, since he did not even know her to be in Bath, It immediately occurred that something might be done in her favour by the influence of the woman he loved, and she had been hastily preparing to interest Anne's feelings as far as the observances due to Mr. Elliot's character would allow, when Anne's refutation of the supposed engagement changed the face of everything. And while it took from her the new formed hope of succeeding in the object of her first anxiety, left her at least the comfort of telling the whole story her own way. After listening to this full description of Mr. Elliot, Anne could not but express some surprise at Mrs. Smith's having spoken of him so favourably in the beginning of their conversation. She had seemed to recommend and praise him. "My dear," was Mrs. Smith's reply, "there was nothing else to be done. I considered your marrying him as certain, though he might not yet have made the offer, and I could no more speak the truth of him than if he had been your husband. My heart bled for you as I talked of happiness, and yet he is sensible, he is agreeable, and with such a woman as you, it was not absolutely hopeless. He was very unkind to his first wife. They were wretched together, but she was too ignorant and giddy for respect, and he had never loved her. I was unwilling to hope that you must fare better." Anne could just acknowledge within herself such a possibility of having been induced to marry him as made her shudder at the idea of the misery which must have followed. It was just possible that she might have been persuaded by Lady Russell, and under such a supposition, which would have been most miserable when time had disclosed all too late, it was very desirable that Lady Russell should be no longer deceived, and one of the concluding arrangements of this important conference, which carried them through the greater part of the morning, was that Anne had full liberty to communicate to her friend everything relative to Mrs. Smith in which his conduct was involved. Chapter 22. Anne went home to think over all that she had heard. In one point her feelings were relieved by this knowledge of Mr. Elliot. There was no longer anything of tenderness due to him. He stood, as opposed to Captain Wentworth, in all his own unwelcome obtrusiveness. And the evil of his attentions last night, the irremediable mischief he might have done, was considered with sensations unqualified and perplexed. Pity for him was all over, but this was the only point of relief. In every other respect, in looking around her or penetrating forward, she saw more to distress than to apprehend. She was concerned for the disappointment and pain Lady Russell would be feeling, for the mortifications which must be hanging over her father and sister, and had all the distress of foreseeing many evils without knowing how to avert any one of them. She was most thankful for her own knowledge of him. She had never considered herself as entitled to reward for not slighting an old friend like Mrs. Smith, but here was a reward indeed springing from it. Mrs. Smith had been able to tell her that what no one else could have done. Could the knowledge have been extended through her family? But this was a vain idea. She must talk to Lady Russell, tell her, consult with her, and having done her best, wait the event with as much composure as possible. And after all, her greatest want of composure would be in that quarter of the mind which could not be open to Lady Russell, in that flow of anxieties and fears which must be all to herself. She found on reaching home that she had, as she intended, escaped seeing Mr. Elliot, that he had called and paid them a long morning visit, but hardly had she congratulated herself and felt safe till tomorrow, when she heard that he was coming again in the evening. "I had not the smallest intention of asking him," said Elizabeth, with affected carelessness, "but he gave me so many hints. So Mrs. Clay says, at least. Indeed, I do say it. I never saw anybody in my life spell harder for an invitation. Poor man! I was really in pain for him, for your hard-hearted sister, Miss Anne, seems bent on cruelty." "Oh," cried Elizabeth, "I have been rather too much used to the game to be soon overcome by a gentleman's hints. However, when I found how excessively he was regretting that he should miss my father this morning, I gave way immediately, for I would never really omit an opportunity of bringing him and Sir Walter together. They appeared to so much advantage in company with each other, each behaving so pleasantly, Mr. Elliot looking up with so much respect. "Quite delightful," cried Mrs. Clay, not daring, however, to turn her eyes towards Anne. "Exactly like father and son. Dear Miss Elliot, may I not say father and son?" "Oh, I lay no embargo on anybody's words, if you will have such ideas. But upon my word, I'm scarcely sensible of his attentions being beyond those of other men." "Oh, my dear Miss Elliot," exclaimed Mrs. Clay, lifting up her hands and eyes, and sinking all the rest of her astonishment in a convenient silence. "Well, my dear Penelope, you need not be so alarmed about him. I did invite him, you know. I sent him away with smiles. When I found he was really going to his friends at Thornbury Park for the whole day tomorrow, I had compassion on him, and admired the good acting of the friend in being able to show such pleasure as she did in the expectation and in the actual arrival of the very person whose presence must really be interfering with her prime object. It was impossible but that Mrs. Clay must hate the sight of Mr. Elliot, and yet she could assume a most obliging, placid look, and appear quite satisfied with the curtailed license of devoting herself only half as much to Sir Walter as she would have done otherwise. To Anne herself it was most distressing to see Mr. Elliot enter the room, and quite painful to have him approach and speak to her. She had been used before to feel that he could not be always quite sincere, but now she saw insincerity in everything. His attentive deference to her father, contrasted with his former language, was odious, and when she thought of his cruel conduct towards Mrs. Smith, she could hardly bear the sight of his present smiles and mildness, or the sound of his artificial good sentiments. She meant to avoid any such alteration of manners as might provoke a remonstrance on his side. It was a great object with her to escape all inquiry or éclat, but it was her intention to be as decidedly cool to him as might be compatible with their relationship, and to retrace as quietly as she could the few steps of unnecessary intimacy she had been gradually led along. She was accordingly more guarded and more cool than she had been the night before. He wanted to animate her curiosity again as to how and where he could have heard her formerly praised, wanted very much to be gratified by more solicitation, but the charm was broken. He found that the heat and animation of a public room were necessary to kindle his modest cousin's vanity. He found at least that it was not to be done now by any of those attempts which he could hazard among the too commanding claims of the others. He little surmised that it was the subject acting now exactly against his interest, bringing immediately into her thoughts all those parts of his conduct which were least excusable. She had some satisfaction in finding that he was really going out of Bath the next morning, going early, and that he would be gone the greater part of 2 days. He was invited again to Camden Place the very evening of his return, but from Thursday to Saturday evening his absence was certain. It was bad enough that a Mrs. Clay should be always before her, but that a deeper hypocrite should be added to their party seemed the destruction of everything like peace and comfort. It was so humiliating to reflect on the constant deception practiced on her father and Elizabeth, to consider the various sources of mortification preparing for them. Mrs. Clay's selfishness was not so complicate nor so revolting as his, and Anne would have compounded for the marriage at once, with all its evils, to be clear of Mr. Elliot's subtleties in endeavouring to prevent it. On Friday morning she meant to go very early to Lady Russell and accomplish the necessary communication, and she would have gone directly after breakfast, but that Mrs. Clay was also going out on some obliging purpose of saving her sister trouble, which determined her to wait till she might be safe from such a companion. She saw Mrs. Clay fairly off, therefore, before she began to talk of spending the morning in Rivers Street. "Very well," said Elizabeth, "I have nothing to send but my love. Oh, you may as well take back the tiresome book she would lend me, and pretend I have read it through. I really cannot be plaguing myself forever with all the new poems and states of the nation that come out. Lady Russell quite bores one with her new publications. You need not tell her so, but I thought her dress hideous the other night. I used to think she had some taste in dress, but I was ashamed of her at the concert. Something so formal and arrangé in her air, and she sits so upright. My best love, of course. And mine, added Sir Walter, kindest regards. And you may say that I mean to call upon her soon, make a civil message, but I shall only leave my card. Morning visits are never fair by women at her time of life, who make themselves up so little. If she could only wear rouge, she would not be afraid of being seen, but last time I called I observed the blinds were let down immediately. While her father spoke, there was a knock at the door. Who could it be? And remembering the preconcerted visits at all hours of Mr. Elliot, would have expected him but for his known engagement 7 miles off. After the usual period of suspense, the usual sounds of approach were heard, and Mr. and Mrs. Charles Musgrove were ushered into the room. Surprise was the strongest emotion raised by their appearance, but Anne was really glad to see them, and the others were not so sorry but that they could put on a decent air of welcome. And as soon as it became clear that these their nearest relations, were not arrived with any views of accommodation in that house, Sir Walter and Elizabeth were able to rise in cordiality and do the honours of it very well. They were come to Bath for a few days with Mrs. Musgrove and were at the White Hart. So much was pretty soon understood, but till Sir Walter and Elizabeth were walking Mary into the other drawing room and regarding themselves with her admiration, and could not draw upon Charles's brain for a regular history of their coming, or an explanation of some smiling hints of particular business which had been ostentatiously dropped by Mary, as well as of some apparent confusion as to whom their party consisted of. She then found that it consisted of Mrs. Musgrove, Henrietta, and Captain Harville, besides their two selves. He gave her a very plain, intelligible account of the whole, a narration in which she saw a great deal of most characteristic proceeding. The scheme had received its first impulse by Captain Harville's wanting to come to Bath on business. He had begun to talk of it a week ago, and by way of doing something as shooting was over, Charles had proposed coming with him, and Mrs. Harville had seemed to like the idea of it very much as an advantage to her husband. But Mary could not bear to be left, and had made herself so unhappy about it that for a day or two everything seemed to be in suspense or at an end. But then it had been taken up by his father and mother. His mother had some old friends in Bath whom she wanted to see. It was thought a good opportunity for Henrietta to come and buy wedding clothes for herself and her sister. And in short, it ended in being his mother's party, that everything might be comfortable and easy to Captain Harville, and he and Mary were included in it by way of general inconvenience. They had arrived late the night before. Mrs. Harville, her children, and Captain Benwick remained with Mr. Musgrove and Louisa at Uppercross. Anne's only surprise was that affairs should be in forwardness enough for Henrietta's wedding clothes to be talked of. She had imagined such difficulties of fortune to exist there as must prevent the marriage from being near at hand, but she learned from Charles that very recently, since Mary's last letter to herself, Charles Hayter had been applied to by a friend to hold a living for a youth who could not possibly claim it under many years. And that on the strength of this present income, with almost a certainty of something more permanent long before the term in question, the two families had consented to the young people's wishes, and that their marriage was likely to take place in a few months, quite as soon as Louisa's. And a very good living it was, Charles added, only 25 miles from Uppercross, and in a very fine country, fine part of Dorsetshire, in the centre of some of the best preserves in the kingdom, surrounded by 3 great proprietors, each more careful and jealous than the other, and to 2 of the 3 at least, Charles Hayter might get a special recommendation. Not that he will value it as he ought, he observed. Charles is too cool about sporting. That's the worst of him. I'm certainly glad indeed, cried Anne, particularly glad that this should happen, and that of 2 sisters who both deserve equally well, and who have always been such good friends, the pleasant prospects of one should not be dimming those of the other, that they should be so equal in their prosperity and comfort. I hope your father and mother are quite happy with regard to both. Oh, yes, my father would be as well pleased if the gentleman were richer, but he has no other fault to find. Money, coming down with money, two daughters at once, it cannot be a very agreeable operation, and it straightens him as to many things. However, I do not mean to say that they have not a right to it. It is very fit that they should have daughters' shares, and I'm sure he has always been a very kind liberal father to me. Mary does not above half like Henrietta's match. She never did, but she does not do him justice, nor think enough about Winthrop. I cannot make her attend to the value of the property. It is a very fair match as times go, and I have liked Charles Hayter all my life, and I shall not leave now. Such excellent parents as Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove, exclaimed Anne, should be happy in their children's marriages. They do everything to confer happiness, I'm sure. What a blessing to young people to be in such hands. Your father and mother seem so totally free from all those ambitious feelings which have led to so much misconduct and misery, both in young and old. I hope you think Louisa perfectly recovered now? He answered rather hesitatingly, "Yes, I believe I do, very much recovered, but she is altered. There is no running or jumping about, no laughing or dancing. It is quite different. If one happens only to shut the door a little hard, she starts and wriggles like a young dabchick in the water, and Benwick sits at her elbow, reading verses or whispering to her all day long."